We're back for the final day and therefore the final lecture to this series, everyone. Learning philosophy through Sophie's world is coming to a close, and we only have one last really important matter to speak of, and I'm going to separate this into three parts. We're going to first dwell for a moment on the significance of what Gaarder shares at the end of his book regarding the inflationary nature of the universe. And we're also then going to move into talking about Gaarder's philosophy, none other than Gaarder's philosophy. Please note as a disclaimer, however, that I do not actually know how Gaarder would describe his own philosophy. While I've watched an interview or two and read stuff on Gaarder in the past, I've never gotten the sense that he wanted to promote a specific view with a specific name. And in fact, this is an interesting trend among many philosophers and thinkers, is they often don't wish to give their particular philosophy a name, if only perhaps to prevent being pigeonholed, or maybe it's in order to be as original or unique as possible. I actually like embracing certain titles and labels because I think it actually adds clarity to a picture, even if it means that you have to retract certain elements within the philosophy under that label in order to fit it to your unique stance. It's still better, I think, to say as an artist, for instance, that I'm a punctualist or an impressionist, and then go from there, always with the option of changing my mind later, than it is to say, no, what I'm doing is something insanely different nobody's ever done before. It makes it that much harder for people to likely grasp and understand you. So we are going to only be using Sophie's World as the guide for understanding Gaarder's philosophy today. That is, given what he has written in the text, this will inform us of what I am calling his fictional realism, and this is a really good exercise to yourself attempt at approaching any philosopher or thinker's text. How do I surmise what this person thinks, whether you have a label for it or not? How can I get the gist of what it is that they're trying to say in a way that contributes to the larger picture of philosophical history? Now, after we speak on Gaarder, I will also give my own take on the philosophy. That is, I'm going to juxtapose it, if only for the sake of providing another example, places where I agree with him and where our philosophies would overlap, and places where they would clearly not overlap, so that you can see yet another modern day contemporary stance in philosophy that is juxtaposed to a similar, or even in some cases dissimilar one. So first, on the nature of the known universe. So Gaarder mentions the expansion of, he's in the chapter of the Big Bang specifically, he's mentioning the expansion of the universe and what all that entails. I'm going to start here with the anatomy of a black hole. There are some very interesting little parallels here that I think are worth exploring between the universe, a black hole, and something that I'll later explain when we come to an object-oriented philosophy. So here we can see the anatomy of a black hole. This is pretty straightforward. If you haven't seen, by the way, a real picture of a real black hole before, simply look those up. They are gorgeous.
Well, it took a long time.
I mean, look at this. That was it. That was the first image.
So here we have the anatomy of the black hole. And let's start at the outermost area. We have what's called the accretion disk. And then there's the rest of known space, and we know what that looks like more or less, although there's lots of mysteries beyond that too. Getting back to the black hole, the accretion disk is this huge sort of cloud, almost like the rings around a planet, but it's this cloud of accreting gases and particles and other things that are more or less, you could say, within orbit of a black hole, but are still capable of escaping from that orbit and so forth. So it's not exactly the same thing as, say, a planet. Innermost stable orbit then is closest to something that would resemble, say, the orbit of the moon around the Earth. So this layer right here is where things are not likely to escape and go further into space again. However, they are also not necessarily, in fact, by definition, pulled. They will not be pulled toward the black hole and therefore sucked in. They just sort of orbit around for eternity as far as we're concerned. And then you have what's called the event horizon. The event horizon is an interesting place. This is where it gets tumultuous. It's the event horizon beyond the point of which, or even within that boundary line, that things are liable to get pulled into the black hole. And a black hole is fascinating for a number of reasons. I'm going to bring it up again later so we can see what its main, fundamental, most interesting trait might be. But it's interesting in part because, of course, as you know, light itself cannot escape from the black hole, which means that it must be pulling in at an acceleration rate that is beyond, that is faster, a velocity that is beyond what light itself can overcome. So things are pulled in, and there's no sense of how time would possibly work in that regard, how space functions in that regard, only that we imagine this sort of three-dimensional funnel, which is not quite right because a three-dimensional funnel still goes in a certain direction in three-dimensional space. It must therefore be a three-dimensional object that operates, though, within a four-dimensional. It has four-dimensionality in its function. That is, as it pulls things in, it's almost a funnel that funnels into perhaps a four-dimensional space, and we don't know where that goes. We don't know what that looks like. Now, we'll say more about that later because it's fascinating to think about this in parallel analogy to the philosophy that I want to tell you about later. So what I want to do now is I want you to see the parallel between this and our understanding of the universe. In particular, pay attention to that event horizon there. Things beyond this event horizon inside the black hole, we have no way of fathoming or understanding. Now, one way I like to think about the anatomy of the known universe is as almost this inversion of the anatomy of the black hole. So as you can see here, we are in space, obviously. This is our part of the universe, and theoretically at least, there are many parts of the universe that if we simply develop the technologies in time, that time being of the essence though, for a number of reasons, then we could possibly reach any point in this arena of space, within this sphere. Remember, this is three-dimensional, so within this sphere of space, we would be capable of reaching certain points, perhaps not all at once. Perhaps we would have to be very careful in selecting which points we would actually be able to reach, but hypothetically, theoretically, we could reach any of these points if we chose to do so with the technologies available to do so. Then there is a part of our universe that is not going to be available to us beyond observation. In other words, the rate at which our galaxies are drifting apart from each other, it will be impossible to reach some of them in time, even if we had the technology today to do so, to travel even at light speeds. It would be because even though the speed of light is or light is the fastest thing we know in this universe, so the speed of light you would think would be incapable of being overcome, as it were. The one thing that you could say moves faster than the speed of light is the space in which light itself travels. So while no thing really moves faster than light, space itself accelerates outward from itself. And so, as it were, if we could go the speed of light, we could not reach certain parts of the universe that are accelerating farther away than we can travel. Now, that doesn't mean that the things that we observe aren't really there. As it were, they're of course dated, and as Gaarder does a really excellent job of explaining how and why we're seeing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years into the past, at times even billions of years if we have the right telescope technology to utilize. So some of these parts of the universe are simply observable and not reachable. This is not, by the way, to scale or anything. I wouldn't know exactly what parts would be which. It's quite possible that the observable universe is a significant amount greater, and I would think so, than the reachable universe. But this will work for our purposes today. So what is this? This outer edge here that we call the cosmic event horizon is similar in respect to the black hole's event horizon. Beyond the black hole's event horizon, we cannot receive any information of anything. There's nothing to observe, there's nothing to be reached. If we were to traverse it, we would be forever caught in the black hole ourselves, unable to communicate with anything beyond the event horizon. Same thing is going on here. That event horizon is, as it were, the boundary point beyond which whatever's out there has no relation to us whatsoever. I'm stressing that for a reason, because we're going to see in a second that part of what Gaarder believes, appears to believe anyway, via his voicing as such through Albert Nag, is that there is a lot of credit to be given to holism. And I'm not saying necessarily that holism isn't an interesting philosophical point, but we need to bear in mind what holism means. So we'll get back to that in a second. Now, that event horizon, therefore, is, as I said, the boundary line, and anything beyond that is going to be unreachable by us, unobservable by us. And here's the funny thing about that. It's not static. At every second, we can imagine more and more stars, perhaps whole galaxies, disappearing. I believe it's every 15 seconds or something absolutely absurd like that. Another galaxy escapes beyond what we call the cosmic event horizon, beyond our potential observation of it, and certainly our reachability of it. We lose information at an insanely incredible rate. This should make us incredibly humble. Part of why I think this nature of the universe stuff is so important to philosophy is that we get very caught up in things like scientific realism. And we're going to have to really tone down the manner in which we take science to be the be-all of our being in this universe, as our way of knowing the universe. I want you to imagine for a second that you are a mite. I don't know if you've ever seen like little dust mite, little tiny mite, a dust mite as it were. And those things live all over the place, but let's just try and be, hygienically appropriate and imagine a mite that lives, say, on in a field, in the middle of a field out there. It could be a soccer field, whatever you like. That thing is immensely big to that mite. There is no doubt. That mite could probably, within its lifetime, maybe reach certain parts of that field, unless it gets blown by the wind, but let's just assume it has to crawl there. It might be able even to receive some sense of information of things from beyond the reach of the field. That is, the winds and other things that come through and blow it around and then leaves the drum, so forth. Things that it will otherwise never be able to reach itself, would not have been able to reach, but it's going to be affected by the sun, it's going to be affected directly or indirectly by far-off mountains and so forth, perhaps even in some cases. That mite we recognize easily. That field is but a small patch compared to the expanse of the earth, and that mite is immensely small to us, and it makes sense that they couldn't reach these things, but we would never probably look at a colony of mites and think, even if they had scientific reasoning to expand themselves beyond the field, we would never think that they were that advanced. To the point of perhaps even hubris, we humans tend to get so confident about our ability to utilize science and to know this universe, we don't realize that we are the mites. This is the field, and there is so much beyond it we will never come to know. We will never ever come to know, even with the greatest uses of our scientific equipment. Why? Because our scientific equipment, our scientific method requires the ability to empirically verify things and therefore to have some access to information. But if that information is beyond a horizon, beyond our ability to receive anymore, it's gone. Imagine what expansive universe we must actually live in then that we don't actually know about. It should make us humble. It should make us very humble. I'm going to come back to this in a moment because I think that this also will help us frame in a way that even Gaarder didn't quite get at. A way to frame philosophy and in particular for me, an object-oriented philosophy, such that we can also see that it's not just about the very, very big, nor even just the very, very small. More on that in a moment. We need to talk about Gaarder's philosophy. Again, what I'm calling fictional realism. I love this picture. You can see that is Anderson, as you recall, Christian Andersen, who conceptualized and in some cases collected and reconceptualized many stories of folklore during the Romantic period. To quote Gaarder directly so that we get a sense of what he is meaning by this book and why I can call this, I think, fairly confidently fictional realism, let's go to page 284. Towards the bottom of the page, they're talking about Berkeley. It's in the chapter on Berkeley, which, if you couldn't tell, was the most important chapter for him in a sense, at least in terms of the climax of this book. So we expect things to be important things about his philosophy to show up here. Let's start with Sophie. She says, "Is it not even certain that we exist?" This will be important, right? "Yes and no," says Alberto. "Everything we see and feel is an effect of God's power," said Berkeley. "For God is intimately present in our consciousness, causing to exist for us the profusion of ideas and perceptions that we are constantly subject to. The whole world around us and our whole life exist in God. He is the one cause of everything that exists. We exist only in the mind of God." I am amazed, to put it mildly. So, here it is. Highlight this. To be or not to be is not the whole question. The question is also who we are. Are we really human beings of flesh and blood? Does our world consist of real things, or are we encircled by the mind? Now, you can disregard most of that other stuff regarding God and so forth if you wish, because this is the critical question. Does our world consist of real things, or are we encircled by the mind? Well, which is it? Is what you and I call reality necessarily things that exist independently and of their own right? Or do they, as it were, really exist within some form of mind? Are we in some form of mind? Now, this could end up making Gaarder actually an anti-realist in some respects, because to indicate that all things, as it were, exist only as it were in the mind of something, hence as thoughts or ideas of some mind, would make him an outright idealist. Or if in the course of this story, he is actually saying that nature, that as it were the structure of how reality is in our world, how it is that real things are, is in parallel to the way things exist in mind. Let's go to another page. So on page 470 here, he's talking about New Ageism, as you remember, end of our own time, that chapter. And this part is worth rereading. "All true philosophers should keep their eyes open. Even if we have never seen a white crow, we should never stop looking for it. And one day, even a skeptic like me could be obliged to accept a phenomenon I did not believe in before. If I did not keep this possibility open, I would be dogmatic and not a true philosopher." His thought about fictional beings coming into reality, because that's essentially what's happened, right? It's not as if Sophie and Alberto simply disappear when the story is over that Albert Nag writes. They, as it were, enter the reality that you and I live in. And in doing so, they become part of it. If you go back and recall what we said about the nature of this existence of these fictional entities, such as Sophie and Alberto, but also such as, Little Red Riding Hood and all the others, the gnomes, the fairies, the elves that are at the end of the story, then you'll recall that there is some minute sense of causality even between these fictional creatures, these fictional characters, and the reality that you and I live in. It's almost like there's parallel dimensions here. And I'm going to use this word dimensions for now, not too strictly, because we often mean something else by that, mathematically and such. But let's just keep it to imagine layers to reality, as it were. And so there's the reality that you and I are in, which are perhaps let's call it for now anyway, the non-fictional entities. And then there's a layer that are the fictional entities. So the fictional entities would seem to have a very minute ability to cause things to happen in our world. That is the non-fictional layer. And we could see that in cases like where the car drives off and they are actually causing the wheat to fall, and Alberto says they'll blame the winds tomorrow. Or Sophie and Alberto manage to let loose the canoe, the rowboat, that goes off into the lake. Or when Sophie, of course, takes a hammer, don't try this at home, kids, and slams it down on Hilda's forehead, causing her to feel something the equivalent of a gadfly sting. It would seem there's some influence, at least a minute amount. Now that's from the fictional layer to the non-fictional layer. What about the other way around? Well, Alberto goes fully into that. In fact, the fictional layer has nothing but influences from the non-fictional layer. Why? Because that's where the fictional layer even comes to exist. Where did Alberto and Sophie come from? They came from the mind of Albert Nag. And Albert Nag has complete control over them up until the point that they escape. And when they escape, they then become real entities. Real in the sense that they have entered the world and they now have an independent and autonomous existence. That is a really important phrase there, independent and autonomous existence. We're going to come back to that when I talk about the contrasting philosophy I want to give to this. But for Alberto, that is what happens. Fictional entities would appear, not Alberto, but Gaarder. It would seem that these fictional entities become, as it were, real in the sense that they become autonomous and independent of us. Bugs Bunny, Santa Claus, Mickey Mouse, they all come to some extent for him to be real. So, and again, that being our working definition of real, independent and autonomous, then we can see that yes, the non-fictional layer would have an obvious direct effect on the fictional layer, if only because it's where the fictional layer comes from. And then the fictional layer would appear to be capable of actually becoming real. What makes it real, by the way? What do you suppose? An interesting element to this story is how frequently Hilda believes these characters must exist in some form. They must be real in some way. That was something we highlighted multiple times throughout this story. Maybe that is how fictional characters become so everlasting. They seem almost permanently within the culture. Everybody knows who Winnie the Pooh is. Now, it's possible that 100 years from now, no one will know who Winnie the Pooh is. However, I wouldn't have expected people to understand at this point who the Ninja Turtles are. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as a childhood plaything of my own. I would have not expected that nearly half a century later that people would still be talking about them and that people would still wear costumes of them. Now, that's something in my own life. Hans Christian Andersen came up with many of these fairy tale items hundreds of years ago. So they seem to have a life of their own. And in Gaarder's view, this life is perhaps best explained as a reality of their own that perseveres even when the individual minds, including the minds that created them, fade away, die out, are no longer with us. There's something else here, though. There's one last thing, because I think, cheapskating it a little bit by saying there's a fictional and a non-fictional layer. Because if those fictional entities are real, true in a way that's slightly different from our own, nonetheless still seem to follow similar laws. Alberto could not crash into the Batmobile without them getting harmed. They could go through walls in the non-fictional layer, what I'm dubbing still the non-fictional layer. They could go through walls from that layer, but if they encountered a fictional wall, a wall that was built there that somehow, came up as an important element to the story, maybe the wall of Humpty Dumpty, they would crash and burn. They would be truly hurt by it, it would seem. At least that seems to be Alberto's concern, and I think we can take it to the bank for the moment. So, how different is that from what I've been calling the non-fictional layer? How different is that except the fact that they can actually perceive the layer before them? They are, in a sense, looking back at this other layer and operating within it, though in such a way that they feel that they operate within their layer, and they can also operate within our layer in a way that gives them a sense too of where they come from. There's a really good reason, I think, that Gaarder ends this book talking about the Big Bang and the universe at large, the known universe. Isn't this what we do too? We have, going back to that cosmic picture again for a second, we have no influence on most of what is in this picture, even parts of the reachable universe that we might eventually have a minute or dim ability to influence or impact in some way. We certainly don't have it at the moment, and it won't be without truly great strain that we are capable of doing so. Are we not too some layer that would seem to sit on top of a much larger, greater layer that is the cause of us, and we are aware of it? We're aware that we come from stardust. We're aware of so many of these things. We are aware of where we come from. Where does that come from? That layer that gave rise to us, where did that come from? That is unknown. In the same way that Alberto and Sophie can only be as aware as they are of Albert Nag and Hilda and the layer above them, but cannot know Gaarder, have no inkling really of Gaarder. The closest they came was to a legitimate hypothetical reasoning by Sophie, that if Alberto and Sophie have an author, could not Albert Nag and Hilda as well? Hinting at the possibility that there is something beyond them, but not impossible, as it were, incapable of putting their finger on who that could be, Gaarder himself. Could that be true of us too? Can we hypothesize that there is something greater than the Big Bang in the universe? Something that is responsible for that? We come from the Big Bang in the universe. We get that. We have ways of even being in touch with that in some way, informationally, and verifying that in ways. But we could only hypothesize what is beyond that cosmic event horizon, and even what is beyond the span of time. We can't go further back than the Big Bang. Even if we were to change our theories eventually, the start of time is not something we could go beyond. And so it is impossible for us to perhaps know of a creator beyond the creation, the layer of creation that is us. Maybe that's what we ultimately mean by God. Maybe not. Gaarder doesn't put his foot down on atheism versus theism for himself, not in this book. One last thing. On 512, we're getting to the very, very end of the book. Literally only a few paragraphs away from the end. On 512, towards the top, Alberto says, "You and I also began with the Big Bang, because all substance in the universe is an organic unity. Once, in a primeval age, all matter was gathered in a clump so enormously massive that a pinhead weighed many billions of tons. This primeval atom exploded because of the enormous gravitation. It was as if something disintegrated. When we look up at the sky, we are trying to find the way back to ourselves. All the stars and galaxies in the universe are made of the same substance." Interesting notion. "Parts of it have lumped themselves together, some here, some there. There can be billions of light years between one galaxy and the next, but they all have the same origin. All stars and all planets belong to the same family. But what is this earthly substance? What was it that exploded that time billions of years ago? Where did it come from? That is the big question, at least in regards to science." And Alberto continues, "And a question that concerns us all very deeply, for we ourselves are of that substance. We are a spark from the great fire that was ignited many billions of years ago." So this tells us practically everything. It's one substance, for one thing. Remember, Gaarder has posed to us only two numerical types or categories for understanding substance. He has proposed throughout the book on multiple occasions monism, which you remember means one substance, and dualism, or two substance. We would usually want to call this substance monism and substance dualism to prevent confusion with other types of monism and dualism. If you can't tell, the guy's a monist. He's a blatant substance monist. He never mentioned the other category, though. We did. We touched on it way back in modern philosophy. Do you remember pluralism? What is substance pluralism? Substance pluralism doesn't give in to the idea that monism or dualism have quite the right answer. That monism would seem to indicate that all is one, and dualism would seem to indicate that there needs to be some sort of dichotomy between two specific types of thing in the world. Both are ultimately, to a pluralist anyway, somewhat boring. So I will say more on substance pluralism in a moment. But we need to recognize that this is what Gaarder is. He's a monist here. Read that first sentence again. You and I also began with the Big Bang because all substance in the universe is an organic unity. This is what we call holism. You've heard me use that term already. Holism indicates that everything is connected somehow, and there's no such thing as something as far away as that cosmic event horizon that I showed earlier. There's something the farthest away that can possibly be, and myself. There's still some relation there. How can the relation be there? The relation is there because we would all come from the same place, and we're of the same substance. It's a very interesting proposal, and it's not the first time this proposal has been made. That all the universe can be explained by some sort of oneness or unity. Everything's one, man, right? This is his way of thinking about the world already. What that substance is, he does not claim to be able to say. Maybe that's not the point. Maybe trying to pin it down like the pre-Socratics by saying it's all essentially water, which these are all very simplistic ways of thinking, of describing the ways they were thinking. But anyway, everything's water, everything's fire, whatever it might be. Maybe trying to nail what that substance is isn't the correct question. It is a big question, says Sophie, but maybe it's not the most important question, again, because the whole point here is he's an existentialist too. And his existentialist philosophy is that the important thing is that we exist, not how we exist or what we are, just that we are. So this substance monism then perhaps again hints at the possibility that we aren't that different then from even fictional entities. That fictional realism indicates then that really fictional things are the reality, and we are among them. We are as fictional as the next thing. Well, perhaps not as fictional. We are a different sort of fictional, perhaps. We are fictional in a sense, though, that we can't interact with the next layer of which we generate, but nonetheless, mind would seem to beget mind, would beget mind, and so forth. This appears to be Gaarder's philosophy. I'm ready to move on. We're going to talk about the anatomy of a black hole again in a second. If there's one thing that continues to bug me more than any other when it comes to philosophical thinking in history, including Gaarder's, it's that we give so much emphasis and credit to human beings and minds. I'm not saying they're not bizarrely interesting. And again, if it turns out that the brain really is the most complex thing that exists in the universe, it certainly would appear to be in the known universe, I don't want to discredit the interesting value of that complexity. And I'm not equating brains with minds, of course. So mind itself is inherently beautiful, incredible to think about. It's one of the last enduring questions we have, sometimes posed as the hard question, which is, what is consciousness? However, in over-prioritizing the human being and mind, we might be doing ourselves a huge disservice. The truth, in my view, is that the universe is far weirder than even Gaarder is able to explicate here. And it would have to start with us divorcing for a moment from this idea that minds are the most interesting thing in the universe. Again, that would be like saying that the might, whatever culture or incredible things that it develops, is the most interesting thing in our world, despite it, and it can make that claim. It's the most interesting thing in its own world, perhaps, but that is precluding knowledge or the ability to understand anything about things outside of itself. Think of all that space, all that universe beyond that we still don't know about or understand anything about. And think about all the universe that we don't know about that is also right here in this very moment. Quantum physics and quantum theory is incredibly interesting. And any of these that seem to purport that mind is the essential element to it, I think is way off the mark. But I won't go into critiques of quantum mechanics in this lecture right now. Let's go back to the black hole for a second. The most interesting thing, all of this is interesting, but to me, the most interesting thing about the black hole is this part here, the singularity. The singularity is that funnel that I was talking about, except it's not the funnel itself. It's the point that everything that the black hole funnels toward is aiming at. It's a point in the sense, as far as that it is also a non-point. It is not a point in that it can actually be reached. This is what we call in mathematics an asymptote. An asymptote is any line on a two-dimensional plane. It's not the only place that comes up, but it's one we can think of. You can also have asymptotic planes, but let's just think of a line. You've seen graphs before. There are some lines that no matter how close the curve ever gets to it, it will never actually reach it. You could go forever, hypothetically. And I'm not going to talk about what I think are the limits to the concept of infinity today either. But the point is that it's never reached. If I were to cut, if I could somehow forever cut something in half, between 0 and 1, cut in half over and over and over again, I would never reach an end. And that quantity, you could say, that amount of infinity is no greater or less, specifically no less, than if I were to take the length between 0 and 10 and cut that in half forever and ever and ever. So why am I speaking this way about infinities and so forth? Why am I talking about this? Because that's how weird our universe is. Imagine, though, that the singularity doesn't just involve black holes. It doesn't just exist within a black hole. That is a singularity of a space-time warp, a warping or distortion of space-time that Einstein and Hawking and others later developed as a way to understand what black holes are doing. But if we start getting into the metaphysics that I care to talk about here, just as the black hole has an interesting parallel, analogous parallel to the known universe and unknown universe, I suppose, let's talk about the anatomy of a thing, specifically a real thing. First, I'm going to have to distinguish again what I mean by real. We just defined it a moment ago. Real as something that is independent and autonomous from anything else. When we're talking about a real thing in the world, we're talking about something that has that independence and that autonomy that a thing that is not real fails to have. It does not have. So, in my view, unlike Gaarder, I would not propose that fictional entities, in fact, have a reality. Because I think that would, again, make things interesting, and it makes for a beautiful philosophy. It also, though, I think, doesn't get at what is truly weird about this universe. It doesn't get weird enough, I think. Because, as it were, if everything fictional stood to become a reality or have its own reality, then my critique of this is that in almost a Kantian way, in the way that he talks about his own antinomies, what would the term real really stand for anymore? What would real really determine? How would you juxtapose what is real from what is pure flight of fancy? Well, only those things that don't persevere or exist over time longer. Is that what Gaarder would say? Well, then New Age, a lot of those thoughts in New Age thinking have persevered for a long, long time, or have reemerged elements from older mythologies and stuff that maybe we wouldn't say are real. Maybe he would, but didn't seem to feature in his book. He didn't bring up Ra or any of those among his fictional elements. He stuck pretty well to the fictional characters from Romantic period onward and didn't mention anything about the gods and other things that would have been introduced through mythology, and we could even call a sort of literature at earlier times. So it doesn't seem clear to me that he is making a clear distinction. But I think it is important to make that distinction. What is real is independent and autonomous. That much we can give credit towards his philosophy too, but not all things are equally real. All things equally exist. What does that mean? Am I going to make now a counterpoint that's going to seem to run along the same lines of fallacy? Well, let's find out. Real versus existing. To exist is to be in the world at all, versus to be real is to exist in the world, as it were, but to exist in it in a way that is independent and autonomous from other things. Now, I bring up the black hole example parallel because this is what precisely what we mean by a substance, as it were, the thing, at least in this object-oriented approach to philosophy and metaphysics. The substance would be, as it were, the singularity. It would be the thing that could never itself be truly reached. It is independent and autonomous beyond such a point that we would be capable of reaching it. Now, you're real, chances are, and I'm real. This computer screen's real, the mouse is real, the cursor is real. Everything is real, at least so far as we can actually directly perceive it in some way, perceive it through our senses as opposed through simply our mind. However, that's not quite accurate either, because we never really perceive or sense real things if they are, as it were, withdrawn into this subterranean almost part of reality where everything, as it were, is a singularity, or what Leibniz would call a monad. In mathematics, this is also something that has a specific definition that I won't get into, having to do with the nature of those infinities I was talking about, but in a way that's different from what Cantor said. So the substance, as it were, is a thing. It is a real thing, and every real thing is a substance, its own unique substance. When we're talking, therefore, in this way about a substance, we're talking about any actual real thing. This is substance pluralism, at least one version of it. However, as I said, not all things sensed or so forth are real. As it were, actually, we are only capable of directly accessing the phenomenal things of our world. Phenomenal qualities, but also the things that are themselves phenomenal. That is, fictional characters themselves can be viewed as not real, but truly existing. They are equally existing as any real thing, such as you and me, but they are not equally real. In fact, they do not have the independence and autonomy beyond this book, as we would think. So they exist within the mind, as it were. And as a phenomenal thing, it is possible for them to persevere over time, because we share phenomenal things with each other. We're capable of sharing those themes, and we're capable of sharing the things themselves, but they do not exist independently of us. If all the human species were to be wiped out in a single motion, then Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd and Mickey Mouse and Sophie and Alberto would cease to exist. It would cease to exist altogether. That indicates that they cannot have an independent, autonomous reality. Now, maybe in Gaarder's world, they would continue to exist, but I would push back on this. I really doubt that there's any credence to be given to such an idea. This anatomy of the real thing then tells us that the substance is the thing itself. It is that thing in itself, that Ding an sich, that Kant was talking about earlier. At least it's a close version of that. And it is definitely along the same lines as what Leibniz meant back in modern philosophy. Leibniz meant by the monad. And we also, though, can speak of an essence to a thing, but the essence is, oddly enough, not something that pre-exists the thing itself. Therefore, we're not going to give a lot of credence to, say, the immortal soul, or Plato's version of this essence, because it really is an essence that we create after the fact. You and I can understand through reason the essence of something. What is its fundamental, important features, its real, the things about it that cannot be extracted from it without that thing ceasing to be what it is. So the idea of a soul maybe feels somehow related to the substance itself, but it will be divorced from the idea of an essence. Unless by a soul, we mean the soul or essence of something, we mean the style of something, and that's a whole nother bag of beans that we won't get into. There are qualities, phenomenal qualities that surround the essence of something. May get at the heart as close to the heart as we can get, because we can never truly get at the heart of anything any more than we can get at the singularity inside of a black hole. There are infinities of infinities that stand between us and that singularity. Infinities of infinities stand between us and any real thing, the actual substance, the real thing itself. However, we can talk about the essence of things. You will have perhaps a different sense of what my essence is than I might have of yours, but ultimately we can probably agree on what essential qualities, essential things are necessary for a thing to be what it is. A chair has to be able to be sat on. If it's not, could be a number of things, but it won't be a chair. So the essence, as it were, is something that we, in a way, almost have to construct, but it's not all constructed. It has something definitely to do with the nature of the thing itself as well, as far as we can also, to some extent, know what it is to be real. Now, there's phenomenal qualities that you can see also surround and, as it were, are captured, or once captured, but also occasionally released by the real things. Right now, I look and appear to you the way I do, but if I am still Kelsey and have been my entire life, and I choose to believe I am Kelsey, even though multiple times over, all the cells in my body have changed over, have died off and been replaced by new cells, and so technically, physically speaking, I cannot be the same entity completely. I am nonetheless the same Kelsey. Due to this essential quality, the essential parts of myself, the phenomenal qualities then are simply the things that you can perceive at any particular time about me, or feel of me, or sense of me. And same goes with all these other things. The phenomenal qualities are the most, as it were, ephemeral things. I turn this around and it's changing color as I go. It's beautiful, by the way. I love this paperweight. The colors, everything about it, it all has a sort of subjective sense to it. No, there's no doubt about it. But it's not subjective in and of itself. It is not something that exists by way of my subjectivity. It's because of an interaction between its qualities, its particular nature and state, and me perceiving it. And so the phenomenal qualities of this thing are also important. And yet, the ultimate picture I have of this, even in my mind, is itself a phenomenal thing, not the real thing. The real thing I could never truly get at. Nonetheless, I can presume it's there, and I will presume it's there as a realist. Presume it is truly, really there, but as it were, completely inaccessible to me, by me. And that is what our world is comprised of, except I don't even want to say the world. Really, we have to think about it as worlds in general, because if we take that cosmic event horizon seriously, then we have to recognize there are a plethora, if not an infinite number, potentially. I don't believe it would be an infinite number, but nonetheless, a large number of things that would not have any relation to one another. And therefore, I would reject Gaarder's holism and the idea that everything is interconnected. It's an interesting idea, and I do believe there are patches within frameworks, worlds in themselves that have interconnection between them and are connected in different ways. But there's also this important concept of asymmetry. Imagine that you and I have not talked to each other before. Imagine you're among people in the stratosphere who might watch this video, and in some way, you have a relation to me because you're watching the video and you're hearing my words and you know a lot about me. I know nothing about you. I have no direct relation to you in any sense. I could live the rest of my life and never know who you are because I never came in contact with you. I have no relation. The relation between you and me is one way. It's one-sided, where you are influenced and I am not. Same goes with me and, say, the monumental mountain of an Everest or a Fuji or any of the Rockies over here, the 14ers, where I am just skimming the surface by climbing them, or even just looking at them from a distance can admire their beauty and be awestruck by it and be highly influenced by it, and not vice versa. That mountain could not likely have any sense that I'm there. This also, though, gives way to an important other thing. Is that because the mountain doesn't experience things? And way earlier in the course, I talked about how the definition of experience has been too loose so far. Perhaps we give so much priority to human beings and minds because we believe that the only sort of experience is the sort of experience that requires a knowing, a creating of a theory or an idea as such of what something is and so forth, that experience requires perception and senses and all these other things. But why? Why are we confined to such a narrow version of experience that really is just based on our own anthropocentrism? Why not think of experience more broadly? Maybe the mountain really does experience in some form or other the trees that rest upon it, that the sun experiences its own fires and its own light that it gives out, even if it never comes to know us. Well, no, it doesn't have senses, it doesn't have perception, but maybe this experience can help us understand, too, a different version of causality, which I don't have the time to go into here. But a causality, then, a way of causally relating to one another that does not have simply to do with billiard balls crashing together and forcing each other, but has everything to do with influences and has a lot to do with a number of other things that we have talked about throughout this course on ontology and metaphysics. Now, you might be rightly wondering, well then, Kelsey, this makes no sense. How can we know of anything? Absolutely. Gaarder seems to be given to the idea that even if all else is, somewhat weird, science still comes to know of things. But he never explains what knowledge is. What do we mean by knowledge? Why did we start this course off being so adamant about the fact that philosophy is not the love of knowledge, but the love of wisdom? Perhaps knowing is not the same thing as simply gleaning information about things or reflecting on things and coming to understand them better. Knowledge, as it were, would seem to be a sort of post hoc creation of theories and structures and things that we have to create, literally create, in order to try and understand the world. But in understanding the world, we understand the world as it is for us, not the world as it is for the gadfly or for the flower or for the sun. We don't make theories based on what those experiences would be like, only what we could possibly experience ourselves, and in that way understand. Which is part of what makes mathematics so inherently interesting, because there are things beyond perhaps our direct intuitive understanding that we still seem to be able to play around with. But as fascinating as that is, we'll have to get into that maybe sometime in the future in another course. And so, in a way, substance pluralism is speaking to the individualism that we've brought up time and again, but not in the framework of existentialism, but in the framework of an ontology, a metaphysics of individualism. And you would be right again to question, well, then the knowledge aspect, so does this mean I can't truly know anything? I would say that we know all sorts of things, but keep in mind again, the knowledge is what we've created of those things. But things are so individual in a way, and I don't mean to allude to a hyper-individualism because that's a political reference. I mean individualistic in the sense that things are so unique and so themselves and so ultimately withdrawn from one another that it is impossible to have direct access to anything. We cannot directly access the sun in some sort of grasp of it that is all-knowing and capable of understanding at once all about the sun and its features. We can only do our best and theorize and make these sort of structures and stuff and never really get closer to the actual real sun. That means that when we speak of truth, we have to be careful of what we mean by that. What is true would appear to be partly granted on what seems to be consistent with our theories and so forth in science. But maybe it's better to say that science is not in the business of trying to understand what is true, but trying to, and always failing, but ultimately still always trying, because it's important for us to do so, to attempt to understand the real, because in doing so we construct realities that give us all sorts of benefits. It's astounding to get to explore. We are exploring reality even if we never get direct access to it, or can say that our knowledge is anything that penetrates more deeply than simply the expanded boundaries of our world that we ourselves can play in. So this is all very abstract, and I'm very aware of that. However, again, I wanted to give a sense of how this is different from Gaarder, where even he would admit to a sort of epistemological realism, perhaps, that science can come to know these things in some point of fact. And the fact that he never gets beyond the cosmic event horizon, and the fact that he, in a sense, equivocates existing as a fictional entity as the same as existing as a real entity in some form or fashion. I feel these are definitely places where he and I depart. True, being an epistemological anti-realism means that I can't say science truly grasps or understands the true, beyond the essence we construct, the truth of a thing. And at the same time, that does not mean that I think that science is all humbug and hogwash. But this is definitely where we're different. I would say that as an ontological realist, I have to say that there is a distinction to be made between fictional and non-fictional entities. And it goes well beyond fiction, that the things of our minds, the phenomenal entities, are not to be confused with the things that are truly real in the world. That said, there is overlap between myself and Gaarder, if only in this place where we agree that the universe is a weird place. To whatever extent we can even talk about it in its wholeness, that's where I'm different from him. We can nonetheless agree that it is a weird place. That fictional entities do exist in some form, even if it is not, for me, in a form that is on par with real entities. And philosophy throughout history has basically discredited fictional entities. If you remember Hume, for instance, a really good example, probably not starting with Hume, didn't start with Hume, but definitely including Hume and pushed thoroughly by Hume and others, that these things ought to be committed to the flames. But what if fictional entities are an existing thing? What if they exist for you and me, even if they do not exist autonomously in the world beyond us? Then these are things that we need to include in a philosophy, not disclude, not preclude from existence, as it were. We have no reason to do so. Now, if you happen to feel that we didn't spend quite as much time on Gaarder's philosophy as you had hoped, don't worry. We'll see you in the Q&R section where we will flush out more of the details. See you there.